So that was a short arrangement of the American folk song Goodnight Irene, and I chose that one so I could go ahead and work in some secondary dominants. Recall that in my previous video I've been talking about how secondary dominants can be used to move between chords in a way where you intensify the effect of one chord getting to the next chord. A good example of that in this particular short arrangement is in the first four measures. With this being in the key of G, I've gone ahead and started out with a G triad, and by the way, I kept all the chords in this to triads, even in the instances where I used seventh chords. Secondary dominants often appear that way. In those instances, I went ahead and just omitted some notes to keep the actual chord shape down to 3. In the first measure, then, we have a G triad, in this case, just the G chord in first inversion. It moves through a G sharp diminished triad, not seventh, but just diminished, so 3 notes, to get to the actual A minor chord, the second degree of this scale. Now, the A minor, of course, is diatonic. So moving between G and A minor is simply going from the first to second degree of the scale in terms of the chords, the diatonic chords that work there, G major, A minor. The G sharp diminished between them then, as you can kind of physically see, literally connects them by way of half steps. You can see that I'm moving just 3, 4, 5 on the guitar neck. And it provides a little heightened interest. That is to say, it increases the push towards that second chord as I leave the G major chord. And that's really the only purpose of it. It's just to help add a little bit of extra push and to smooth out the voice leading so that you've got some more half steps moving around within the voices that are the 3 notes of the chord in this case. In that same second measure, I then go ahead and take that A minor chord and convert it to a A7 chord. In this case, I'm omitting the 5th. Got the root A, there's the 3rd C sharp, 7 on top, so I've left the E out. It's quite common to leave 5ths out, even roots in some cases, but in this case I just kept the 5th out, so then I could go smoothly to the D major chord that follows it. Now by doing that, I've converted what was that minor chord, A minor, the second degree of this scale, to a dominant 7th chord. So in effect, I've made it what's called that 5 of 5, because the 5th in this particular key of G is D as in dog. And that's the target chord. And the A7 that I preceded that chord with sets up the push in a more intense way towards that D chord. So once again, I just went ahead and slipped that in there so it would help draw the listener's ear, not draw so much as push the listener's ear closer to where I wanted it to be, which was that coming D chord. And again, we would call that a 5 of 5 because I'm creating a dominant 7th chord where there isn't normally one, but I'm not really changing the function of the 2 chord. That is to say, the 2 chord often does move to 5, as you've seen in some of my other videos if you've watched them about chord progressions. 2-5-1 is a really common chord progression. In the key of G, as a reminder, that would mean taking the chord of some kind that's A, usually minor, moving to D, either as a dominant chord, meaning a triad, or dominant 7, 4 notes in it, and then resolving to the G chord, 2-5-1. So here what I've gone ahead and done is to intensify the effect of moving instead of from just A minor to D. I've passed through a dominant 7th chord, which again, if you listen to that first string note, it becomes pretty apparent that I'm just moving between A to G to F sharp, and that G to F sharp sounds like a much more interesting resolution to where I was going, rather than just moving straight from the A minor to the D in this case. In the next 2 measures, I move simply between D to D, the same chord, but I use them in 2 different inversions. This version with the 5th on the bottom, A, D, F sharp, a very common first position shape for this chord, to the first inversion of D major, F sharp, A, D. But between them I stick in a C sharp diminished chord, which in this case is acting like a secondary dominant. We would call that a 7 of 5 in this case. So I'm leaving the 5 chord, going to that secondary dominant, which immediately pushes your ear back toward that chord as I then resolve it to the first inversion shape of D major. Obviously, I could go the other way around too. But in fact, I'm just bouncing from the D downward by half step and back to the D to help emphasize the D chord. Another way secondary dominants can be really useful. So the rest of this arrangement, if you download the PDF that's linked in the description, uses some of the same ideas between diminished chords, sometimes also treated as diminished 7ths, and dominant chords, treated both as dominant, meaning just a major triad, and also as dominant 7. Keep in mind when we say secondary dominance, it doesn't automatically imply that it's a 7th chord. Frequently they are, as in the example I just provided with that A7, but they don't have to be. In fact, later in this piece, I use a 5 of 3 chord, where the 5 is simply an F sharp major chord. In this case, it's the one that's voiced farther up the neck that resolves to the 3 chord. So, and that motion is just meant to highlight, again, those half steps, drawing, in this case, moving half step upward toward the resolution of the B minor chord, which in this key is the 3 chord. That case in point, which arrives there in between measures 13 and 14, also highlights something else which is really common. In measure 14 specifically, I go ahead and use the actual 5 of 3 chord I just mentioned to play a note, the highest note in this case, which is an A sharp. And at that moment in the melody, normally there's an A natural, but I went ahead and make it sharp there to help push the listener's ear into that next chord. Because there's only a half step difference between what the melody normally does there and the note that was altered, it doesn't sound like a huge change. But this is another common practice when you're arranging things in chord melody. You take the contour of the melody and you make sure to maintain that when you want to. And sometimes that means, though, you still have some wiggle room to go ahead and change notes between half steps, even steps in some cases, depending on how the movement between the chords is. In this case, since that F sharp movement I mentioned is so smooth and close to the B minor, the alteration of A to A sharp isn't as noticeable. It's also the only place in the melody where I do that. And again, fundamentally what's going on there is I'm trying to drive the listener's ear up to that B chord, the B minor chord, where we get a half note, meaning you sit on it for a little longer than the quarter notes that have come just before it. So once again, that A sharp helps do that in a more compelling way than an A natural. Even though the melody note might be A natural, A sharp works just fine there. It's worth noting then in the measures after that, as I head towards the final part of this arrangement, I convert the A back to an A natural as I play the F sharp diminished chord, which is just the diminished chord in this key, meaning the 7th degree, the one built off the leading tone, and then resolve finally to a G, again in first inversion. So again, a lot of chord shapes flying around here that we've seen before, but the way I'm using them now involves moving them around in specific ways to highlight the chord that I'm heading toward, the target chord I keep saying. So download that PDF, take a look at it. Hopefully you'll get some use out of it in terms of understanding a little bit more about how we're moving through songs with an idea that we can go ahead and add chords that are non-diatonic, which is what those secondary dominants are, in such a way to help add to the contour, not only of the melody, of course, because we want to make sure we adhere to that as much as we can, but also add to the overall harmonic movement of the song, meaning making it a little more interesting sometimes and maybe a little more bland others. Again, there's always that balancing between what we call tension and resolution, or consonance and dissonance. And that's baked into this kind of thing when you start dealing with reconciling secondary dominance against diatonic chords and then making sure the melody is not being completely blurred. Take care.